All right, looks like we are live. Welcome everybody. I'm Scott. This is Drawing Together with Artists Network. Welcome back everybody. A lot of familiar names here on the list, so it's great to be back with you all. We meet every Wednesday now, 3 p.m. Eastern, and today this is what we're working on. This is the first subject of which we actually tackled in this whole Drawing Together series was a simple cup. So I thought this is a great opportunity now that we're 59 episodes in to kind of look back to where things started and see if we can notice any sort of development or progression. That's really the whole point of this this whole series, is that while so many of us are at home, this is a great time for us to sharpen our skills and improve, especially our drawing. So I myself am a painter, as I think a lot of you are as well, and using this time to develop our drawing skills can really help improve those other art kind of skills, those practices that we have. So again, this is what we're working on here. This is an initial drawing that I had done to kind of warm up. I see some issues with it that I would like to tackle, and in particular, I'm looking at these ellipses, these kind of ovals that we use to define the three-dimensional form of a cup or a cylinder, and I see a disconnect between the upper and the lower curves. And so throughout this episode, that's one of the things we're going to be focusing on. And a big thing that we'll be looking at is working with light and shadow, and in particular creating a sense of form and volume using light and shadow. So that's something that we addressed a lot early on in this series, and I want to kind of step back to that and really try to focus in on that. We're keeping the materials very simple today, so I've got two charcoal pencils. I've got a 6B and an HB with this one. So this one's a little bit harder, the HB, and then I have my softer 6B here that I can get those richer darks with. I've got my trusty blending stump here that has been well used, and I really like it for this. I also have my kneaded eraser and my plastic or rubber eraser if you've got one of those. This is the Hanamulla rag paper that I am very nearly out of, so I think I need to find more. I think I have one sheet left, so I was very bummed to see that. But this is about 8.5 by 11, so this is a relatively small drawing. You may find that for you, working a little bit larger might be actually more helpful. There's kind of a balance when you're looking at size to finding that if it's too small, then sometimes we end up spending more time just trying to tweak very minor things. And of course, the smaller we go, the more crucial getting your proportions is going to be right. So if you're off by just a fraction of an inch on a small drawing, it may be more noticeable than if you're off by a fraction of an inch on a larger drawing. And also, there's, again, on the large scale, there's a balance to be struck. The large ego, sometimes that could be overwhelming. What I like to consider when I'm thinking about the size of the paper is just really what's comfortable for me to draw. So in this case, I have my reference image up here on this big screen on the left. You're going to want to know that you can find the reference image in the description below. You'll find a bit.ly link that you want to copy and paste into a browser, and that brings up your full screen reference image. And you can print that out if you'd like to do as well. I prefer to work from a digital screen. I've got this camera overhead that's projected on the screen right in front of me, and that allows me to see what you all see and also kind of step back from the drawing. So because I have this drawing laid out in front of me at the slight angle, I'm going to be compensating for a certain amount of perspective, and I may not get a proper view at the drawing. So looking at the screen in front of me that has this overhead camera, I can see it squared up properly, and I can observe any sort of proportion and perspective distortions. So kind of keep that in mind as we're working. Being able to step back can be a really big thing. So before we do that, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in all caps. I see them more easily. I love seeing that everybody is kind of signing in. We've got about 100 people here. Let's see if we can get that up. Again, as we go along, feel free to type out on any of your questions. I'm going to do my best to observe those and kind of catch them as we go. One of the things that I had done in my initial attempt at drawing a cup was I started with vine charcoal. And I really I kind of enjoyed kind of working away from that in this one. So let's see what works here. You may want to pick up a vine charcoal stick and work this way as well. This is the HB. It's a little bit lighter and it's a bit of a harder material. But what I want to do at this point is just to start to get marks on the page. And you can see with drawing an oval, it can be really tricky. The way to develop that skill that I found most effective is to practice with this overhand grip. So using the side of the pencil, lock the wrist, lock the fingers, and really draw from the shoulder, and practice drawing these ovals. Now, one of the things that I observed in this reference image is that oval seems to have a bit of an axis to it. If we find the two widest points and draw a line between them, it's largely horizontal, but there's a slight tilt to it. And you can get a feel for that. If I exaggerate that here by drawing this ellipse, you can see that we have one axis here, we have another axis here. And I just want to start to pay attention to that so that it's in my mind as I start to build up this drawing. So as you can see right now, I'm just kind of making a mess on the page, and that's going to be fine because I ultimately want to build up charcoal. There's so much white here that I'm going to want to get rid of that. But in the service of doing that, I can use this opportunity just to warm up and start making marks on the page. So with this overhand grip, you can see I'm also supporting my hand using this finger. That gives me a little bit more control, but all of the drawing is really happening from the shoulder. And for those of you who have been with me for a while, you'll have heard me say this before, but this early stage is really all about getting information on the page. And then once we have information on the page, it becomes easier to make very specific suggestions and decisions around what needs to change and what needs to move. What are the proportions correct? Are the values correct, etc. So these early attempts are just about getting information on the page, knowing that none of this is correct, but we're going to continue to adjust it. I'm doing a little bit of angle sighting to kind of observe the angle of the edge of the table. That's actually this guy right here, this end table that I've got, that I kind of set my coffee cup up. And I chose to actually keep it dirty because I liked what happens with the stains from the coffee on the inside of the cup. It gives some visual information that helps to define that interior curve. One of the things that was challenging in the first attempt at this drawing early on in the whole series, the first drawing in the series, is that when it was all cleaned out, it starts to feel like just a white wall back there, and it's hard to really see what that volume is. And so if anybody is looking for that, you're going to be able to find that initial video up on in YouTube. It's in the playlist. It might be actually most effective to go to artistnetwork.com. If you go to the Drawing Together page there's a list of all the subjects, and you'll see a cup listed there, and that can bring up the first episode for you. You can kind of get a sense for what that looked like. And actually, I'm not sure if we actually shared the reference photo from that first episode either, so this can give you a chance to work on that. So just working very quickly. Again, I'm just kind of building up information here. And one of the approaches that we like to address here is for us to build the whole drawing up at once. So this is going to look like a mess at first, and then ideally this is all going to come together into something that looks more lifelike and more realistic as we go. So part of this drawing process kind of requires or kind of encourages us to be comfortable with messiness. It's kind of part of the process that can be challenging, but I feel is ultimately healthier when you're developing a drawing habit, is to be comfortable with the idea of powering through just the mess of it. We call it the ugly duckling stage here, that every drawing tends to go through, but I think what that represents ultimately is the struggle that we all face as artists, and when we demonstrate a struggle, it opens the viewer up to seeing a bit more of what's happening in our minds as artists. So what I'm doing now is I'm trying to think about really the placement of the cup on the page. So I'm referencing, again, the overhead camera just to get a sense for where it's located, just to make sure that it's all going to fit on there to begin with. And then once I'm comfortable with how it all fits, then we can adjust it accordingly. So a lot of what's happening right now is me observing the reference photo and then trying to react to it, glancing at the page just to make sure I'm kind of in the right spot. Robert F. is saying, I often find it actually easier to draw a portrait than a coffee cup, believe it or not. A cup is a precise geometric shape, a perfect cylinder, so the contours and ellipticals have to be perfect. That is a really great comment. I'm glad you mentioned that. It's in my mind, what it comes down to is the amount of visual information that you can utilize. What can you lean on to help you pull the drawing together? And with something simple like this, there's not a lot of visual information. So as you're saying, Robert, there's what it does is it just puts more pressure on the aspects of the subject that we can actually observe. And there's, there's just less information. With a portrait, like I said, there's a lot more information for us to look at. And those are all tools that help us to rein in the proportions. I think what I'm going to do here for this drawing is try to minimize the line work around the edges, kind of keeping in mind the way we've been tackling a lot of drawings lately in this series. The way we confront edges is it plays a big role in how realistic that subject looks. Does it feel naturalistic? And then a lot of that is built again on our control over the edges, how sharp that edge is, how much contrast there is, whether we're using a line or whether we're using values to define an edge. So I'm just kind of doing some negative drawing in here, blocking in some of the shapes, knowing that this central form of the cup will actually ultimately be light against that dark background. And as I'm building up these values, you can see I'm utilizing the side of the pencil, holding it way back so I don't have a whole lot of pressure control. It's really just utilizing the weight of the pencil. And as I do that, I'm trying to roll the pencil in my fingers so that I'm constantly kind of rounding that out. I can see there's already a flat spot forming there that could be problematic later on in the drawing. So utilizing the side of the pencil also helps to ensure that we're not kind of embossing the page or kind of embedding the charcoal in the paper. It'll be a lot easier to erase out later if we do that. So just building this up, using the side of my hand rather than the oily fingers to kind of smooth that out. And then Robert's saying, yeah, that's another great comment, when I draw and sketch around like crazy nonstop and then make it messy until all the proportions are accurate, and then I just slowly refine and polish it. And that's a really, again, a really good description of the process. And the way I like to define it, and again, for those of you who have been with us for a while, you'll have heard me say this, but I want the drawing to evolve and develop at the same rate as my observations about the subject. So when I come to this subject initially, I can look at it quickly and recognize it as a cup. My brain fills that in, it just says, all right, it's a cup. As I study it, though, as I look at it more, I can start to ask myself, well, how do I know that? And what are the particular qualities of this cup that are really critical for that? And that is what the drawing process is all about. I'm using the drawing process to understand that. How do I know that this is a cup and what makes this cup unique? I'm using that drawing process to get to that point. And I'm also using my observations to improve the drawing. They kind of work together at the same point, at the same rate. And so that the idea of kind of sketching and sketching and sketching and kind of refining those proportions as you go, it kind of aligns with that. That describes it really well. Is that when we look at a subject initially, we typically just reach the point of recognition rather than that point of analysis where we really consider that the criteria that we're using to ultimately define what that is. So the handle is a tricky thing. And as you can see, I haven't blocked that out. I'm going to use my eraser to cut that back out rather than get too kind of persnickety with it at this point. But I can start to map out that form. And one of the things I'm doing here is it's really more for my brain at this point. I'm trying to understand what is happening with that handle. And you can see it's this band that wraps around. And so you can kind of see a flatness to it across that plane. But it's not flat, there's also a rounded quality. So those are the two things that I'm trying to hold in my head at the same time. And what can be helpful at this stage is to try to think simultaneously about the positive space and the negative space. So the negative space is the shape of the wood that's seen around that handle. The positive space would be the handle itself. And if you're able to kind of switch your thinking back and forth between both of those things, it can sometimes help you get to an accurate proportion more quickly. I want to be careful with the direction of my marks here. So I also want to be mindful about the fact that we've got this hole here and we've got the negative space around it. That's all one object. If I run my marks in the hole vertically and then the background horizontally, we'll perceive that and see them as two separate shapes, and I want them to seem as though they're one shape. So I need to be mindful of the direction of my marks at this point. I mean, those are really great comments that you posted there, Robert. So if anybody else has any kind of descriptions of your own process, that even if they run counter to mine, that's especially if they run counter to mine. Actually, I want to hear that. There are innumerable ways to approach a drawing, and you are all going to find your own way through it. And that's part of what this whole series is about. Is we're drawing together so that we can share those experiences and maybe learn from one another. So as you're seeing something that might be off in my drawing, or if you might have an observation to share about your own process, we really want to hear it. And as you can see right here, what I'm doing is I'm not being precious with the edge. I'm going to be continually refining that edge. And in this case, I can let these marks run right over the edge of the cup. Where I see students struggle sometimes is locking in on an edge too early, because we want to get to that sense of kind of completion as quickly as possible. But once you've kind of said the edge is at a certain spot and you don't want to move it again, then you're kind of in trouble. You have to be willing to adjust as you go. So before I get any farther, I do want to check in some of these comments because there's a lot coming through, and I want to make sure I'm not missing anything. Professor Blue, welcome back. I'm glad to hear. Glad to hear that they are relaxing and informational. Just checking. Okay, I see no comments here, no questions. Oh, Kathy, Carol, can you show us the 3 types of shadow on this cup? Yes, that's a very good point, and I will be bringing that up. Actually, I'm just about ready to get into that stage, so thank you for bringing that up, Kathy. Yeah, I totally agree, Robert. There are only a few contours to draw for a cup, but they have to be really precise to get it to look right. The contour, the aspect of contour drawing is really kind of critical here as well. So yes. And then Nia is saying, I always mess up the proportions of the cup. I end up making the opening of the cup too wide, like an overhead view, and then the cup isn't pictured correctly or directly overhead. That's a really good observation. So I'm going to make sure I address that as well, because that's one of the things that about keeping the subjects simple. And Robert, as you've mentioned, it being simple doesn't mean it's easy or any less relevant to drawing. So like I tell students all the time that if you can draw a simple box or a simple cup, you can draw anything. The principles that we apply here are the same as something that is much more complex. It just requires, something that's more complex may require more attention and just a little bit more kind of sheer work to get through, but you're applying the same type of thinking to this process. So kind of always stepping back and exploring the fundamentals is really crucial for developing your skills. Let's see. And Sally, I am still using the HB pencil. I I haven't switched, but so I'll be switching to the 6B quite a bit later. What I want to do now is that I do want to start to observe the mass of the handle here. So now I can start to do some kind of positive drawings, or kind of negative drawing, I guess, and depending on how you observe it. But I'm using the eraser to kind of refine that shape of the handle here. So again, my awareness is on not just this white shape in that space, but also that negative space. I'm looking at that shape of that handle, the hole in the handle. And then Nia, I haven't forgotten about your question or your comments about the proportions. So we're going to continue to refine that. Right now, I haven't done really any calculated work to define this opening. It's really just an initial reaction on how that feels. In order to correct that, I want to look at this height compared to this height. So if I use comparative measuring, if I close one eye, align the top of my pencil with this part of the cup here, I've moved this thumb so that this finger, so that it aligns with this bottom edge. That gives me a measurement. I can then carry that down so that then this part aligns with this, and my finger aligns with the bottom. And I can almost see a one-to-one correlation. So what I observe in the reference photo is that this distance here is slightly less than this distance. So if I can identify where the bottom of the cup is right now, what should be happening is that this height here should be less than this height, and I have that inverted. So that means I need to open this up. The other thing that I can observe is if I draw a horizontal line from this point here, where this dark shadow crosses over the lip of the cup, if I draw a line across, I can see where does that intersect, or how does it align with the handle, and that this point should align with essentially this part of the handle. So that means something is out of whack here. And again, this is the power of just initiating the drawing with a gesture, an initial reaction to the scene. So now I have something very concrete in front of me that I can use to evaluate those proportions. I feel like this handle could kind of come up a little bit. I can look at this negative space. I can kind of define this curve over here. And then if I draw this line across here, this is ultimately where that edge of the cup should be. And now as I'm going through and correcting the ellipse, you can break that apart into various segments. So I have that initial oval, but that is just to get the conversation started. As I start to refine it, then I can become more I can scrutinize the quality of the curve a little bit more. Let's see. Now what I can do is I can evaluate the width versus the height. So I can use this measurement again. Let me compare that height of the opening, the optical height of the opening, with one. And that's really about twice as wide as this is tall. So the height of this vertical height, this optical height from the back edge to the front edge, it should be half as wide as the width. And it looks like with this new placement of this lip here, then we're in good shape. So then if I essentially define the left and the right parameters, the upper and lower parameters, then I can start to kind of qualify that curve a little bit more. Now, one of the other things that I see students struggle with sometimes too is also pinching the ellipse. This helps to kind of break that a little bit. So if we really just focus on this section here, you can see there's really kind of a gentle curve. And now, with these 4 points established, I can start to refine that edge. And I want to keep my marks very light. Because I don't want those lines to be too dominant. And if I see a line forming like this, My instinct at this point is to soften that, kind of feather that out into that background so that that background kind of consumes that line. And for me, I kind of need to do that as I go. Some artists might look at, just take a mental note of that and then come back to cleaning that up later. But I like to get rid of those lines early on. Even right here, that line is still starting to feel a little bit too dominant. So I'm going to look for those darker areas, darken the background leading up to that, being mindful not to create a halo. If I need to, I can go right over that edge. But I want to kind of feather that out a little bit, allow that background to consume that line. And remember that the drawing process it's a constant evolution. You're going to continue to adjust as you go. So always question in your proportions and always be willing to adjust. And that's where this kind of approach of allowing the drawing to emerge on the page can be helpful, because it kind of facilitates that, that mindset. So as I come into this curve, you can see I'm still locking my wrist, and I'm both kind of dragging the pencil across and pushing it, kind of back and forth until we find the curve that feels right. And then once we have that ellipse, we're quite a bit farther along than we were before. We're much, we've really done a lot of the heavy lifting for this drawing. It doesn't take a whole lot for the viewer's mind to identify the object. The other advantage to this approach, we're building up everything as we go rather than finishing one part at a time. The other advantage to that approach is that it puts you in control of how much detail you need. So you may decide that this is sufficient and you don't really need to refine it more, or you may decide you need to put in a lot more work and really dial in those details. So Ania is asking, what's the view of the cup? I don't think it's a bird's eye view. Could you explain what kind of views there are? Sure. So this is a bit of a bird's eye view. We're above the cup looking down, and it's about a 3/4 view. So I'm actually about a 45-degree angle looking down. If we use the angle of the ground plane and the angle of our gaze, that forms about a 45-degree angle, creating a 3/4 view. And that is intentional because it gives me a glimpse of the two primary dimensions of the object. There's the depth as well as the height. If I would write down at eye level, that I would lose the depth dimension, and that reduces the amount of tools I have at my disposal to create the drawing. With a two-dimensional surface like this, it becomes a challenge to create the illusion of 3 dimensions. So I want to use all the tools I have at my disposal. I want to be able to see as many of the dimensions of the object as I can. If I look at it dead on at eye level, and I can only see one dimension, its height, or I guess 2 dimensions, its height and its width, I don't have the depth, then I'm starting essentially at a 2-dimensional perspective, 2-dimensional view, and it's going to be really difficult to suggest the 3 dimensions. But with this, I have the width, I have the height, and I also have the depth dimension. So that's one of the things I'm thinking about. And then also being above the cup looking down, I see into the cup, so I see the volume of its interior. If I was below the cup and the ellipse curved the other way and blocked the interior, again, I'm just reducing the amount of information I have to explore. So that's kind of what I'm thinking as I go. All right, but I want to start to move along. We're about a half an hour in, and I do want to get into thinking about the shadow terms that are going to be helpful here. So there are 3 shadow terms that you want to know. There's the form shadow, there's the cast shadow, and then there's the shadow shape. The shadows cast by the object are called the cast shadow. So that's what we see over on this section here. That's what's being cast onto the surface of the wood, onto that back wall. That's the cast shadow. The form shadow is the shading on the cup itself. And then the shadow shape is a combination of the two. And if you squint your eyes at this reference photo, the shadow the cast shadow and the form shadow really merge into one. It becomes very difficult to see this edge. And instead you see a shadow shape that looks something like this. So I'm going to start to block that in. And I'm changing up the direction of my marks, and I'm trying to be mindful of any dominant directional marks that are happening in here. You know, I can keep building up layers. I can keep building up layers of these marks, and they'll kind of cancel each other out. But I want to make sure that there's no really strong dominant directional marks that are going to be challenging later. I'm going to go right over this edge. The other thing I'm observing here is that there's kind of a hot spot right in here. There's a highlight. That tells me that this value is darker than this. So even though this is in light, it's a darker value than that. And so I don't have to be precious with the white of the page here. I can build up some of that haze. I'm going to erase that highlight out later. And then in here we have another kind of interior form shadow, but it's kind of a combination of the two. You have a form shadow in here, but this lip is also casting a shadow on itself. So you've got a different type of shadow shape that is sharper along this section, and as we come up here, it starts to become more diffused as it kind of merges with the form shadow on the interior of the cup. So hopefully that helps kind of explain things. And now I have the lip of the cup that I'm going to deal with later, that I'm going to continue to refine. I don't want to get stuck on anything at this point, though. I want to keep floating around and continue to refine, and I think at this point I need to define the bottom of the cup. And as we determined, this height here, this optical height here, is a little bit greater than the height here. So that puts the bottom of the cup kind of somewhere right under here. As I drop in those lines, I want to kind of feather them out a little bit so I don't rely on line too much. I think taking a mental note of my marks along in here. So these diagonal marks, when I'm creating diagonal marks up here, it contrasts nicely against this curve. As I bring those diagonal marks down here, now they align with the edge of that handle, and that could be problematic. So I want to be mindful of that as I go too. The other thing that now I'm putting in my mind is that this HB pencil is harder, meaning it's not going to get quite as dark as the 6B. And I'm noticing that my eyes are calibrating to the values that I have in front of me and starting to observe these values as black and kind of attach the label of black to them, even though they're actually much more of a middle gray. And the same with the light areas. I'm starting to define those as white, even though they're not. I can erase back out to a brighter white. So I'm kind of working in the middle right now, and then I'm going to use I'm going to kind of extract more from the tonal range later on in the drawing. I'll deepen the darks and I'll bring out those highlights, and that's really going to make this drawing come together. So 99% of this drawing is going to exist in a kind of in the range of the value scale, and then right at the end we're going to bring in the darkest darks and the lightest lights to expand that range. If you're not familiar with those terms, or if I'm talking about value and it's kind of foreign to you, what I'm referring to is how light or dark something is. So if you think about a value scale, what it is a range from pure black to pure white, and then all the grays and that gradient in between. And we want to kind of be aware of that. There are some amazing drawings out there that exist in a very narrow value range, and then there are some that have a very full value range. All right, building up more. I like to soften using the palm of my hand. In a real kind of classical setting, you might have kind of gloves that you're wearing to protect the paper. So it's something to think about. If that may be something that you want to do as well, but I don't. That's just not the way I work. So, all right. And then I see some questions coming up. Al Roberts saying, wouldn't it be easier to just sketch in the basic proportions of the cup with lines, only without a background tone yet? That is definitely a way of working that I know a lot of artists work with, but I prefer to try to get to shape and mass as quickly as possible, and then bring line in later. And that could just be a way of dealing with just kind of my own issues, in that when I start with line, it's very difficult for me to then remove the line later. Whereas if I start by mass and then bring the line in later, that line ultimately has more power for me, and I can be more selective with it. And so I think that's just kind of the way I've developed it over time. Starting with the line and not working with the value can be a great way to kind of roadmap the piece a bit, but like I said, this is the way that I've developed, and it's going to work for some of you, but not for others, so whatever works for you. Okay. And then Linda is saying, is the ellipse different distance from the top to middle and middle to bottom? Seems the top curve is farther, so not as deep as the curve on the bottom curve. Yeah, I'm going to continue to refine that curve, but that's a really good observation. So I see right now, for example, a flatness here that I'm going to have to adjust. And I can kind of make some minor tweaks to it as we go. But if for it to exist in true kind of perspective, there would be a slight difference in the quality of the curve from the central axis forward versus the central axis backward, and the same from left to right. So for me, rather than kind of drawing out the linear perspective and try to dial it in that way, I have kind of a rough shape to it now, and now it's just kind of making some kind of subtle tweaks as we observe. So I'm glad you called that out, because that's a really kind of important part of the whole process, is really observing that ellipse. And for me, it takes a little while to get there, and I need to kind of continually adjust and be skeptical of as we go. And you see that edge really is not defined at all, but it's starting to become, we're starting to really see the cup, and I kind of like the atmosphere that's being created right now. And so just like we were just talking about the quality of the curve here, that Lindy, I think, who was that? Was that? Oh, Linda, yeah. Linda kind of called out the quality of the curve of the opening. We can apply that to the cup as well. So one of the things that might be helpful for you is to try to break the curve down into a series of shorter straight marks. So try to observe the angle up here, for example. Compare the basic angle here to the basic angle here, and then it's largely horizontal here. And then as we come across, start to see that as a series of kind of break it apart into a series of shorter, straighter marks. And then once you have that established, you can kind of connect those curves together. And one of the things I like to do in this whole drawing series is approach drawings kind of in a different way. So the next drawing is going to be the skull again, and revisiting that form, but I want to try it with a different material, a different medium than I did the first time. So I'm actually going to try that on toned paper with charcoal and white charcoal as well, or white pastel, whichever one I kind of prefer. So it can be helpful to try the same subject in different media to see how that adjusts your understanding of that subject. Okay. Jessica is talking about the curve of this upper handle. It definitely does. I'm really glad you saw that, and I'm struggling with that right now because I don't quite have it figured out. I have a mark down here, but I know it's wrong. I'm just not quite sure how it should be, because what's happening, if we really look at the quality of this curve, is very, very subtle. And it's not just a smooth curve this way. What I want to observe is how we have kind of one form here, and as again, if we kind of observe it as a band that wraps around, where there's a flat quality of that surface, you can see that that impacts this curve. It starts to become straighter down here, and then into like more of this gentle curve. And as we come under here, it almost feels like there's a slight concave quality to it. It's all very subtle, so I'm trying to keep that in my mind, and I haven't quite erased out this part, but I'm glad you picked that up, because it's key to making this handle look right. I'm going to get rid of that outline. And as I'm doing this, I'm trying to be mindful of where I put the weight on my marks, and it happens very fast, and you may, if you're kind of new to drawing, it may be a little bit slower for you, but I'm kind of making this motion, it's kind of like a circular motion, where I'm kind of placing it next to here and flicking away, bringing it back, placing it on the line, and then flicking away. And if I'm dragging it back, in the backward is very kind of light in touch, and then a heavier mark as we pull away. So that's kind of what I'm thinking there. And as you become more comfortable with drawing, you'll start to pay attention to where you're leaning in on the pencil a little bit more, so that we don't have kind of heavier marks like this, where it gets heavy at the end. Just kind of something that's happening. Thank you, Robert. Cool Cakes and Crafts with Amelia. This is actually an HB charcoal pencil. There are other drawings in this series in which I use a graphite pencil, but for this one I decided to use charcoal. And it's, like I said, it's an HB. It's fairly hard. I'm going to be bringing in a 6B later on for some of the darks. So as I refine this edge here, I'm just using my kneaded eraser. Again, kind of thinking back and forth between the negative space and the positive space to refine that edge. And then that ties into this curve here. And I'm going to intentionally switch to a circular mark so I don't have any kind of directional marks that kind of get into the way. If I run vertical marks, then it can conflict with this vertical edge. It could flatten that out. If I run diagonal marks or curves along here, it could conflict with this one. So I tell students, when in doubt, just use little circles to draw your marks. And as I'm observing this too, I'm also trying to be aware of the values, and I haven't done a whole lot to refine them. What can be really tricky with a white object like this is that it's easy for our mind to latch on to the fact that it's white and just go right for white. The truth is, though, is that it's all very gray, and the brightest spot right here, the only place where we might see the white of the page is right in here. Everything else is going to have a value associated with it. So as I look at this, I'm not being too precious with preserving that. I don't need to preserve the white of the page. So this needs to be addressed right now, I think. As I'm refining that curve, now the white lip along the edge of the cup is factoring into the drawing. So I'm using my plastic eraser here to kind of create that lip. And I'm overstating it, then I'm going to cut that back in later. There's really nothing fundamentally different with the way how I'm using this eraser versus the pencils. I'm still kind of locking the wrist. There you can see I got that curve in there. There's enough of a curve that I can kind of match that, but I need to be careful with that. Because what can happen if I use the wrist too much, then that ultimately defines the curve. and I want that curve to be accurate with my observations, not just a result of how I'm able to kind of pivot along the wrist there. There, because again, I've kind of overstated that. I'm going to refine that a little bit more later. Okay. So now that I have that lip established, what I can do is I can kind of refine this edge. One of the other things that I intentionally placed this cup so that it overlaps the edge of the table, because that gives me another kind of point of reference. That overlapping helps to define the space for the cup to sit in. So I want to get that in there as well. So now in terms of refining that edge, I'm going to kind of work from the outside. I have this kind of, I like this grip a lot. I don't know what it is, but I kind of wedge the pencil between my fingers here, kind of like a chopstick. I have enough room that I can use my thumb and my middle finger to help stabilize when I need to, but I'm still kind of using the side of the pencil, which is nice. And as I work my way up to that edge, I can roll my wrist so that I can engage the tip of the pencil a little bit more. So it gives me a greater range of movement for that pencil with the same control that I would have if I were to switch to this grip here, this tripod grip. This is where having the paper taped down really is, it's just a little annoying, but it kind of works. When I did the preparatory one, I was able to move the paper around, so I do that a lot. If you're wondering, and if you're busy rotating the paper, that's great. I think it's a healthy practice to do that, but just for the purposes of this live stream, I kind of need to have it taped down so that you can clearly see what's happening. So, but feel free to move that paper around all you want. This does kind of force me into kind of these contortions in order to make the curves work. Sticky art channel. This is going to stay black and white. I am working to improve my skills with colored pencil, however. But man, that stuff is hard. And I know some of you watching work in colored pencil, so I have a lot of respect for you all that are doing that. I know we have we're working with some colored pencil artists at Artist Network right now, and I just have a ton of respect for the colored pencil artists, because that is a tricky medium. There's a translucent quality to the colors that is really tricky, and as an oil painter, I'm so used to being able to adjust as I go, and not being able to do that so easily in colored pencil. That's really tricky. So, AZE TV. I'm not sure why this showed up in your suggested video, but I'm glad you're with us. I don't know what the YouTube algorithms, what they do, but this is a space for everybody. We're here to draw together, to improve our drawing skills. So you'll also notice in the description there's a link to a page on artistnetwork.com. It's the show page for this episode, where you can share your work. So if you're drawing along and you want to share your work afterwards, you're invited to do that there. I love to see everybody's work. I've seen a lot of you been posting your work. Some of you kind of build up a whole library of them and then post them all at once, which is awesome. Some of you kind of post as you go. So here's now what I'm doing is, again, in the same type of thinking in terms of positive and negative space. I need to really look at the relationship between this negative space, and kind of this negative space. This makes one space, but kind of mentally, I break it down into those three parts. There's this, and this. and then add to that the positive space of the handle and try to switch back and forth in my mind between those things. It's a bit tricky, but it really will help to define that form. This is not symmetrical. It feels like this is a little bit thinner here than here. And then this edge gets a little bit lost right in here on the inside of that handle. And I haven't pulled out my trusty blending stump, but I'll be bringing that out soon. And that will help to define things as well. I do want to be mindful of the direction of my marks though. Again, I want these spaces here to feel like they're continuations of one another. So as Robert was saying earlier, you know, drawing a cup can be more of a challenge sometimes than something that's perhaps more complex, because again, there's the fewer elements you have in your drawing, the more impact each of those elements will have in the final drawing, in the final interpretation by the viewer. Let's see, how does that? I think that handle reads a little bit better, but I'm going to have to do some value work to kind of clean that up. And I haven't really done much work on the interior, the white portion of the handle. I've done a lot of work on that negative space. Just kind of getting rid of that outline. This feels too curved this way. I feel like it should be kind of straighter and along here. Okay, now as I work my way under here, there's a kind of a shadow, a form shadow on the underside of the cup. And then there's that bottom lip. And so what I'd like to do is I need to place the base of the cup properly. So I'm going to look at that negative space in here to help me, but then also carry a plumb line up to see where it intersects this top lip. And then the same with this bottom portion. It's just maybe slightly to the left of that highlight is where, if I were to draw a plumb line from there, where it would end up. Now, one of the things to kind of keep in mind is because this curve is lower than this opening curve, they're parallel with one another in the cup. So the literal truth is that the opening here and the base are parallel with one another. Optically, however, they're different. So the optical truth is different. So because this is farther down and farther away from us and we're looking down at it more, it's more of an open ellipse. As we get closer to eye level, then that ellipse kind of shrinks. And if this were right at eye level, it would be a flat line. And so I need to remind myself that this curve is going to be greater than this. It's going to be more open than that top ellipse that forms the top of the cup. And I have to remind myself that because sometimes it doesn't feel that way. That's one of the things about observational drawing, is that it forces us to confront, again, the two truths that I was just talking about. There's the literal truth of the cup, and then there's the optical truth. There's the truth of what we're actually seeing. And sometimes our brain has a hard time understanding one over the other. Often we default to the literal truth over the optical truth. And so, again, observational drawing allows us to confront that more easily. Just going to bring the value down here a little bit. Those lines are getting a little bit too strong. So I'm going to cancel them out by drawing some more diagonal marks. And don't be afraid of the eraser, but if you are having trouble erasing out to get the white of the page, one thing to consider is that it could just be the paper itself not anything really that you're doing. This is a cotton rag paper, so I know it has a certain limit to how much I can erase, and that limit is actually pretty great. I can get back down to that brighter white of the page more easily than some other papers. And this is still the HB. I haven't switched to the 6B. That's going to give me the darkest range. So now I can start to define this edge a little bit more. And starting with this kind of unified shadow shape, I can then go in and define the cast shadow from the edge of the cup a little bit more. I want to be careful again with the direction of my marks. This being the table, I have dominant marks running this direction. This shadow is part of the table, so I need to run those marks. Those dominant directional marks need to be in the same direction as in this area where it's more in light. So one of the areas where I see students struggle often is in differentiating the form shadow from the cast shadow. When we stare at the object, we see that edge more clearly. When we blur our focus, we see that edge disappears, and that tells us when an edge disappears when we squint at it. That tells us that the values are closer together than we might ultimately, initially perceive. And so I need to remind myself that the value here is closer to this value than it is to this value. And now I'm intentionally avoiding drawing a line for the edge of this cast shadow because if I draw that line, there's a chance that my brain will perceive that as an edge of a shape when it's not. It's the same table. There's no change in shape, there's just a change in light, there's a change in value. So if I want to avoid that line, I only want to use my line work to define an edge of a distinct object. Okay. What is art? I'm new at drawing realistically. What are some tips you might have? That's a really good question. The biggest tip is to draw a lot. And draw with the mindset that it's you want to get at it quickly. Detail takes a lot of time, but it doesn't give you a whole lot of information. 90% of the drawing is really stuff that you can get to very quickly, and then the detail is a lot of the work that can be very satisfying, but it kind of finishes the drawing. The bulk of the drawing, getting the proportions right, getting perspective, getting form, value, light, shadow, texture, all of that can be achieved relatively quickly. But what I see some students do is they put in a lot of time, and they spend a lot of time in the detail areas that don't necessarily build those skills of getting at the proportion, getting at the perspective, getting at the value, texture, etc. So just something to kind of keep in mind. So do a lot of quick sketching will get you there. I think it's more valuable to fill an entire sketchbook of quick gestures than to do one fully rendered realistic drawing. I think you're going to learn more about how your materials work, and you're going to develop hand-eye coordination more effectively if you kind of have that mindset. So that would be my one kind of takeaway right now. This is still the HB. Okay, so now I'm using my blending stump I'm going to kind of blend in some of this area here. Again, I want to be mindful of the direction of my marks. This shadow here against the wall, I can run my marks vertically because that changes direction. But I want the marks in the shadow to run the same direction as in the light. And then I can switch directions here. And I like to use the side of the blending stump. And one of the things that, for those of you who have been with me, you'll have heard me say, but you always have an opportunity to define the form. You're always contributing to the form. And so even though I have a blending stump and its main the purpose for existing is to smooth things out, it's also an opportunity to contribute to the form. So I can adjust and correct as I go and be mindful of that. This is an opportunity for me to fix things that need to be adjusted. And in this case, I want to be careful about this edge. I like this curve and then comes in on top, and I want that to be sharp. So what I'm going to do is actually run these marks right over that edge. See, I've lost that. I've been really messy with that on purpose. Now I can use my eraser to kind of cut that back out. And I get a kind of cleaner overlap with that form. Okay, now as I look at this form here, there is a slight shadow kind of forming underneath the lip of the cup. So I want to be kind of careful as I do this. Really just dragging this blending stump on its side. That edge here kind of starts to lose a little bit. Now as I work in this form shadow here, I can kind of smooth this out, I kind of feather it out a little bit. Now if you remember, as I've been building up this drawing, I've been kind of wiping that down, building up this haze along in here intentionally, because that allows me to use my eraser to pull out kind of the tonal range a little bit more later on. So it's actually what I want to do now is I want to drop in some of that dirty coffee stain that's in there from that morning latte. So I'm going to use my my blending stump to do that. What I'm doing now is I'm trying to be careful about where I place that. So I'm really trying to look critically at where that interior stain intersects with that front edge. And I'm looking at, how much is to the left, how much of the cup is to the left, how much is to the right. And that interior of the cup has two qualities. It has the curve and also has a vertical quality, or almost vertical. And so if I hold my blending stump vertically, it kind of helps to naturally encourage that kind of vertical plane. So as I'm doing this, as I'm creating this curve, I'm trying to be mindful of this curve and trying to match that. So I'm looking at that negative space, and I'm looking back and forth between the reference photo and the drawing. And it's not an exact, one-to-one representation. I'm trying to get it, I want it to kind of convey kind of coffee stain more than really the particular detail, so that shape is slightly off. And I'm okay with that because I want these marks to feel naturalistic. And in this case, actually, I'm just going to run right over that lip, because again, I can use my eraser to pull that lip out a little bit more later. And now I can start to see where that highlight's going to be. And now as I work in here, I'm going to be in in this shadow here. I can use my pencil to darken the values in here. And again, I'm trying to be mindful of that intersection point right there. And so from that drawing I did in episode 1 of the same cup, I didn't have that. And it kind of limited my ability to really convey that interior sense. So that's dirty stain, while it's relatively unsightly, ultimately serves me well in the drawing. It gives me visual information that's really helpful. All right. So gradually refining here. I do want to take a break to look through any questions. Liza is asking, does the is the paper smooth or does it have a slight tooth to it? It's relatively smooth. This is a rag paper, so there is a tooth to it. Sometimes a charcoal paper will have a distinct tooth, like it's been imprinted. This doesn't have that, but it is relatively rough. And you're going to notice with a rag paper that you can almost feel like you can file off that top surface, and that's kind of what you're doing, which is what enables us to get back to that brighter white. So right in here, I do want to sharpen up this edge. And this may be where I lean on the use of line a little bit more. And then right in here. So by using the side of my pencil for most of the drawing, it always allows me to have that sharp point when I need it. So right in here, for example, I think it's helpful to have a thin, kind of refined line here. So that helps to sharpen that up a bit. And then if I have this edge be a little bit sharper than this edge, that'll create a slight sense of atmospheric perspective and push this back and pop this forward. Kind of smooth this out. I want to encourage the vertical marks in the background here to contrast against this more horizontal curve. Just checking the time, we're about an hour in. If you're just joining us, this is Drawing Together. I'm Scott, and we're with Artist Network. And what we do is we come together every Wednesday now at 3 p.m. Eastern to draw together. I come up with a subject that I find interesting. We work on it together, and we use this time to develop our drawing skills. And intentionally challenging ourselves is part of the process. Because that's how we grow. So, I mean, I haven't had the question in quite a while, but I've had students ask me, well, why don't we use a grid to block this off? And the reason is that I'm intentionally trying to develop my skills in observational drawing to improve my hand-eye coordination in hopes that it will impact my painting ability. And if I use those tools like a grid or tracing to get accurate proportions, that prioritizes the object itself, the object of the drawing. And I like to keep in my mind that there's drawing and then there's the drawing. There's the act of drawing and then there's the object itself. And if I prioritize the act of it, I'm ultimately happier, and then the final product generally turns out better. For me, what's more important is the drawing process than the product. And then the product becomes a reflection, it becomes a record of that event. And I think there's a lot of power in that when we conceive of drawing in that way. And this curve right in here seems a little off, and I think this lip feels a little bit too strong, so I'm going to kind of bring this cast shadow in a little bit more. Okay, and now what I'm observing, if I go back to this handle, is that there's the edge of the band is a little bit brighter right in here, and then it wraps around, and then it right in here in the curve, it cuts down towards the bottom, and where this becomes then the leading edge of that band. Right, and so that kind of helps to create that three-dimensional curve there. And now as I look at this curve, I want to kind of sharpen this up a little bit. And right in here, that curve starts to disappear. How do I feel about that? Let's see. I think what I need to do is I need to pull this out a little bit more. So I'm just kind of mostly tapping with the kneaded eraser to define that edge. And as we come up here, it falls into shadow a bit more. And that transition in value is really kind of, I think, important for conveying that, that three-dimensional form. So right in here, it gets a little bit darker. And then there's a slight gradation as it gets lighter back in, right in here. And now it feels like there's this crimp right in here, so I need to address that. Let's see. Does that work? How does that work? Okay. Feeling like that is effective. And now as I come under here, I can define that edge and now erase this out here, this bottom of the cup where the light's kind of catching it a little bit more on this side. And now, let's see, I'm going to darken this right in here. Still working with the HB, so I haven't switched to the 6B yet, which is going to get me a darker dark. And I want to look at this kind of more critically. Okay, that defines that. This right here is bothering me a bit. It's such a hard line, so I want to try to soften it using that blending stump. And what I need to do, I think, is, you see how blotchy that is? I'm going to use my kneaded eraser to try to target the darker spots to lift off. Just kind of tapping and then blending, seeing where there are darker spots. And I'm noticing now there's issues with this curve, I feel. I feel like what needs to happen? Well, I guess it's okay. I feel like right in here this needs to... Oh, accidentally. I picked up the 6B, so I guess we're going with that. You can see that sharpens that up that a little bit. I can darken the shadow. I can feel it. This is so much softer, so I need to be gentle. I use the razor blade to carve away the wood here and expose more of that charcoal. And I can feel there's some pressure on that. We're starting to flex, so I just want to use the weight of the pencil itself rather than really putting any pressure. Richard Anthony is saying, should I start with to aim off first by getting good at the proportions of still life, and then after getting good move on to values? I don't know as if I would separate the two. I feel like it's really helpful to work back and forth because there's so much value work, and when you think in terms of shape, you can interpret form and proportions differently than with line. And that's one of the reasons why I like to start off my drawing getting to a sense of value and form as quickly as possible rather than line, because I interpret the proportions a bit more effectively. And that may just be the way I work, but it's something to kind of pay attention to you as well, as when you start with line, it can sometimes throw off the proportions. You interpret the scene a little bit differently. So I would try to work both of them, and maybe there's one drawing where you use only line, another drawing where you try to eliminate line altogether, but kind of in terms of your overall skill building, try to work both of them at the same time, if that makes sense. At least that's my take on it. So what I'm doing here now is I'm kind of pushing the values in here a little bit more than what I'm seeing in the reference photo. But what I like about it is that it contrasts in this very dark area with the highlight, which brings my eye into the center. And then it also helps to pop that front lip forward a little bit more. So if I kind of erase this out just a bit, really go for a sharp edge, that'll pop that forward. Let's see. Greg is making a great comment about using the grid for sketching from life. But for me, it still utilizes the act of drawing. Exactly. I think utilizing a grid is certainly a wonderful tool. Depending on your process and what you're going for. Again, for me, when working from life, I don't really have that as an option, and so I'm trying to use this as a way to develop that hand-eye coordination that'll serve me when I'm in the field. So, but again, it's a tool that should be used kind of at your discretion. When you feel like you need it, use it. In general, I like to, if I really need to dial in, if I'm working on a studio piece, rather than use the grid, I'll actually just kind of trace in the proportions to get my initial gesture, and then kind of adjust from there. So what I'll do is I'll take the backside of a drawing or of a photo, cover it with graphite, flip it over, and then kind of trace around the lines, and that transfers a charcoal line onto the surface, and that gets me most of the way there, and then adjust from there. So. Let's see, just looking. Sad, Zach, how can I be an artist? Honestly, I don't know. That's a very large and good question. I think you just do it. And I think labeling yourself an artist or not an artist can become limiting. Just if you like making things, then make them. Kind of readjust that line a little bit. Brush art. When I get into the details, I forget to breathe. I do the same thing. I don't know if you can hear me struggling, but I'm glad you brought that up, because I forget to breathe all the time. That just kind of shows concentration, right? It's like, that's so funny. You do want to breathe. I think that can be helpful, but I get that sentiment. Okay, I'm just kind of sharpening up in some areas, trying to be selective with it. And again, perhaps it's just my own natural kind of limitations that I should probably work on, but when I start a drawing off with the line work being too dominant, I end up having too much line. This way, if I kind of eliminate the line, I can be much more selective, and I feel ultimately it works out better for me, but it may not work for you. Right now, I'm just really evaluating and seeing what needs to happen. I feel like there's some areas in here that I'm neglecting. In the reference photo, I can see the handle being reflected on the surface, so I want to address that. So if I look here at the connection point of the handle to the cup, I can see a bit of a reflection in here. And I like to, before I erase, I like to darken. And then I can pull out the eraser if I need to. We come down here, and now this handle is reflected up here. I'm going to first see if I can create that form by darkening in the space around it. And that's not quite enough, and so I want to come right in here, and I notice the light kind of catches in this form right where the handle meets the cup, the side of the cup. I can bring that up. And that's perhaps a little exaggerated. Now you can see that throughout the drawing I've been kind of wiping this down, building up that haze on the cup, and perhaps it's too much. This area is now rather flat. So I want to work on some variation, and I can also run these marks more vertically along the cross contour of the kind of the belly of the cup to reinforce that dimension. And now, where is the light strongest? It's really difficult to see, but with the light source, with this highlight here, I think the dominant light source is coming in from this direction, so I can start to lighten up here a little bit. So I'm just using the weight of the eraser, kind of these smaller circular marks to create some contrast. And right now it's competing with this highlight, so let me see if I can first get, I really want to I want to make sure that's the brightest I can get. As I erase this out, it's a little bit dominant, but I want to create some variation in here that helps reinforce the three-dimensional nature of this cup. And then I'll kind of knock down that value a little bit so it's not competing with this highlight here. I'm trying to look for kind of dark spots and target those with the eraser as well. Like right in here, there's a little dark spot. But otherwise, I'm just trying to use the weight of the eraser, using pressure control to kind of create some variation in that value shift. And I can knock that down a bit because I have all this charcoal on my hands. Just trying to smooth things out. How does that work? I think that works out all right. Sorry, it probably seems like I'm glaring at you, but I'm sorry, I'm looking at the projection on the screen in front of me, so I can. It's equivalent of stepping back from your work. So if you haven't done that throughout this process, I think it's really helpful to do that. You step back, look at it at a distance, and see what stands out, because your interpretation of the values and the proportions when you're up close are going to be kind of different than when you look at it from a distance. I'm looking at this along this bottom of the cup. It's darker in here, and the highlight really stands out right in here. Not right up against that right edge, but kind of close to it. Give that a bit more form there. I can feel I broke this. I broke this charcoal back here, but it's holding on just barely. So I'm being very gentle with it right now, so I don't lose that. But I think we're pretty much there. I don't know how much more I can add to it, and really ultimately say anything more about the cup. So one of the things that I use as criteria to determine when I'm done is that, have I throughout this drawing process, have I come to understand the form of the cup a bit better? And if it's yes, then I can pretty much say I'm done. If no, then I need to continue to work on it. But you are going to have a different kind of understanding of what done means. So if you need more detail, if you need to sharpen edges, keep working on it. If you felt like you were done ages ago, that's fine too. This process kind of puts you in the driver's seat for that. So I do feel like this edge is a bit ambiguous, so I want to define that a little bit more. I'm looking for any halos around the edges that might be a challenge. And I feel like that works out all right. What I might do, and actually to encourage a greater contrast in values, I don't want to go any lighter here, but if I go darker on this side, it increases the contrast on the right side, which may make this part feel lighter than it actually is. So I'm going to give that a shot right now. I'm going to intentionally darken this edge. And by breaking the core of this charcoal pencil as just barely hanging on, it's forcing me to use really just the weight of the pencil. So as I do that, I don't know if that's really helping a whole lot, but Greg is asking, is there a little reflected light on the left side of the cup? There could be. I think there is a little bit of bounce light coming from back here. On the reference photo, you can see a shift in temperature in this shadow where it's cooler right in here, and then right up along that edge, it gets a little bit warmer. If I were painting, what I would do is I would keep these two values identical, but have a little bit more blue, a little bit more kind of burnt sienna right in here to create that look. When I squint, it's hard for me to tell whether or not there's an actual shift in value because there is some simultaneous contrast happening with this being dark and this being a little bit lighter. this edge is going to feel lighter than it actually is. Right up along that edge, it creates this kind of fluting effect. And that can sometimes be sufficient in suggesting some of that reflected light. What I'm doing now is kind of darkening the shadow core a little bit more, and right in here, a little inset from that edge, and that forces that contrast a little bit. So let's see what that does. That's a good observation there. It's something that I hadn't addressed. See how that works. So when it comes to that reflected light, I very rarely use an eraser to pull that bounce light out. Instead, I try to darken the area next to it. That way it keeps me from overstating that reflected light. That's an area where I see some beginning students kind of need some adjustment, is because in that once you become aware of bounce light in the shadow, there's a tendency to overstate that. And our eyes are very naturally good at perceiving subtle shifts in value. So you can be very, very subtle in your drawing, and the viewer's eye will perceive it. So hopefully that makes sense. That's a really good observation, though. Oh, and then Alleyway, you just said a bit more highlight on the left edge. Yeah, hopefully this is working. Wendy, so much different and better than my first attempt months ago. That's awesome. Well, I'm glad to see that you're with us since day one. I saw a few of you as well. Marie, I saw you chiming in. I believe you were with us in the first class. Nia as well, I believe you were. It's hard to remember. Oh my gosh, we're 59 episodes in. Late March, I think, is when we started this whole series. One of the things I'm observing is along this edge, in this shadow, there's a bit of light you can see that it's coming in, hitting this wall, bouncing on the back side of the cup, and then bouncing back into this cast shadow. So I'm going to see if I can accentuate that a little bit and break up this edge just a touch. And then bring that edge of the cup out just a touch. So I'm kind of forcing things a little bit that may not be visible in the reference photo. And that's kind of fun sometimes to play around with in drawing. So like, this is now all a start that you and you can kind of run with however you want. Like I said, I kind of artificially created a gradient on this ground plane, made this area a little bit darker, made this a little bit lighter to pop that shadow off a bit. You may not want to do that. But I guess it depends on what you think as this being like the heart of the drawing. Is this about the cup? Is it about the light? Is it form? Is it an exercise? Is there symbolism here that you want to kind of extract power from? That's what creates variety in fine art, is that we all have a kind of a different hierarchy of what's important and what this subject is about. All right, I feel like that works out. So I think we're just about done. I could keep picking away at this forever. And you know how much I love it here, but I know we're an hour and a half in, so I don't want to keep you too long. Maureen is asking the question, is your hand leaning on the drawing? Are you suspending your hand over the graphite? So I do have a lip on this table, or this easel, that allows me to kind of rest my hand a little bit. But as you can see, that I also am not precious with it. I don't like to have sheets of paper on top to protect anything, but that's, again, my own personal preference. I know a lot of great artists that do, and they'll use a sheet of parchment paper, wax paper, something to help protect an area of the drawing. But I don't. I like things to get messy and then try to clean them back up. And I like having my hands get dirty. But charcoal is difficult for some people to really kind of access it. I've heard that from some of you who've been following the series, some of you really love getting dirty with charcoal. Some of you have a harder time with that, and I understand that completely. So I don't have that particular kind of sentiment to protect an area of the drawing. I just like to, oh, there it goes, finally gave in. You know, I just see if I end up smudging over an area, I try to fix it. So if I go like this, for example, I didn't do a whole lot, but that kind of darkens that edge. I know that I can come back in with my eraser and clean that back up. And in general, when I do that, it ultimately, it can often lead to strengthening the drawing. So just have faith that you can always fix it if you get it too messy. So I just want to remind you, we meet every Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern. We are doing the skull next week. My intent is to work with that on toned paper. So working charcoal as black charcoal as well as white charcoal. See how that works out. So I'm really excited about that. You can always watch this again. If you want to go to artistnetwork.com, there's a link in the description below. You might have to copy and paste that into your browser. But you can go right to the show page for this where you can see everybody else's work as you've been sharing it. So check that out. And you can see all the other episodes as well on Artist Network. See what other people are sharing and posting. It's been awesome to have this community form. I'm really happy with this. I feel like there is an improvement over my first drawing. I do want to go back and watch that first episode and really see how that worked out. I was a bit nervous for that one, but you were all very kind to me. So. Jessica joined in June. I'm just happy you're here. You can always go back and watch the older episodes. Robert saying an empty cup is a symbol of an empty and still mind in Zen Buddhism. That is a very good thing to be aware of. Thank you for that. There's something pleasing about an empty cup. And actually, kind of messy is good. I really have to realize, and I know I see a lot of great artists, they find kind of ugly things. And then when it's transformed into art, and that it really kind of shows the power of art. You can take things that are perhaps ugly. Through the power of art, you transform it into things that are beautiful. So here in this case, I feel like the coffee stain. If I was looking at it, I'd be like, oh, I got to clean that up. But when it as a drawing, I feel like it adds character and makes it more interesting. So it's something I have to remind myself is that sometimes pretty things don't always make for great art, and sometimes things that are less attractive can actually make for a great drawing or painting. Nia, I will definitely keep working on those colored pencils. I'm glad you all are enjoying it. Thank you all as well. I'm going to hang on for just a few more seconds because there is like a 30-second delay, and I often miss some really great questions. But I'm going to sign off. Thank you all. Keep this running for about 30 more seconds. I will see you all next Wednesday. Have a great weekend. Potosi 1007. I do not do colored pencil yet, but I'm working on it. It's a skill that I am less adept at. So I want to make sure that I can give you something enjoyable to watch when I do colored pencil. So, all right, looks like we are good to go. So I will see you all. Bye.